I've been serializing my book for 3.5 years, and I'm still barely more than halfway through. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, all you need to know for this is that Andy is a 35-year-old rock promoter in the early 90s, and she's married to her best friend Lenny, who's her stand-up teacher, and he's a comedian, and he's now segueing into becoming a comedy writer. And Andy's getting up there in fertility years, because, you know, she's 35, and so she desperately wants to have a baby. Her clock is ticking. And so she recently did get pregnant and had a miscarriage, and she blames herself for smoking a few hits of pot one day in Jamaica. So she's pretty despondent. But then, yeah, and you also need to know that Sal is Lenny's manager, and Cookie is her mom. And then here we are. Okay. Sal and I were increasingly at odds. We genuinely liked each other, but I knew he wanted me dead. Accomplishing the next best thing, he booked Len for a weekend out of town with Lenny's ex, good old Mona. Her new husband, also her agent, suggested we all drive to the gig together. I wasn't working, I had just lost my baby, and I was having no luck getting pregnant. Mona was doing stand-up, getting laughs and adulation and making money. She made me insane. On the flip side, she hadn't quite gotten over Len's reluctance to marry her, nor the speed with which he turned around and wed me. I guess we both could have used some therapy that weekend. Returning home that Sunday night, all was forgiven. I was with child. In spite of some lingering fear, my pregnancy was heaven. Morning sickness and excessive weight gain did not dampen my spirits in the least. Immediately bonding with our developing baby, as soon as the amnio confirmed it was a boy, we anointed him Jack and referred to him by name. One night, somewhere around my 6th month, Lenny and I were watching TV and eating pretzels. Now, I just want to preface this by saying, when I wrote this, I expected you to read it, not for me to read it out loud to you. Oh shit, this is about to be a really bad impression. Go with me here. I can't even do it. Salty. Lenny, I can't do it. In a perfect Homer Simpson. He did a perfect Homer Simpson. So everything I'm going to say is Homer. Imagine Homer really saying it. Salty. You know how somebody say it. Who does Homer? Alan. Anyway, okay, so another night, he got this wide-eyed dumb look when I was getting undressed, and he said, "Oh, look, a naked body." Okay, so Homer became Lenny's alter ego, and he'd more and more frequently let him out to play. Whenever he dropped anything, he'd exclaim, "Do," you know that thing. And, yeah, and he'd be in the supermarket, and he'd go, "Donuts." And he was just, yeah. And if something he didn't like, he'd cock his head, purse his lips, lower his chin, and exclaim, "Marge." The kicker was one night he fell asleep with a sugar daddy in his mouth, who dribbled down his chin. When I went to take it out, he clamped down on it with his lips and continued eating in his sleep. He was Homer, and I was his Marge, and the names just stuck. Despite a difficult 36-hour labor, Jack's birth was profoundly sublime. As predicted, I fell head over heels in love with him at first sight. It was unlike any love I'd ever known. I didn't sleep a wink for 5 days, high on hormones and his sweetness. On the 8th day, as is customary in Jewish tradition, we had his bris, a religious ceremony of circumcision that is nothing short of torture for a first-time mother. Seeing the moil, an old man with shaky hands, drinking wine, and knowing that he's about to approach my son's penis with a knife, it was just too much for me. I retreated to Cookie's bedroom. We were staying with her for a couple of weeks so she could help us with the adjustment to parenthood. There were about 75 friends and family in the living room, eating Jewish delicacies, various smoked fish that would easily gross out even the most adventurous of goyim. Lenny joined me a few minutes later. He was ashen, clearly shaken. Watching his boy's manhood compromised had obviously been too much for him. "Is it over?" I asked, praying that Jack had survived, the trauma intact, other than hopefully a little tiny piece of his foreskin. "Yes, it's over. What do I do now?" Lenny sat on the edge of the bed and placed his head in his hands. "Don't worry, sweetheart," I said, moved by his sensitivity. "Don't worry. How can I not worry? I have to support us and a baby with half my income cut off. How does Jack's foreskin getting snipped affect her income? No, not the bris. After a moment, he gained clarity. Walter, his commercial agent, had just dropped him. In truth, Lenny hadn't scored for a while, but to call a man in the middle of his son's bris to deliver that kind of news was a new kind of ugly. We cried and held each other. As with most dramatic shifts in life, Lenny's was based in need. To deal with the glut of comedians rising out of everywhere in the early to mid-90s, many of the old-timers who hadn't yet broken were forced to be creative to continue making a living. Realizing that perhaps they weren't going to be the next Seinfeld or Shandling, they began writing for those who were. Comedy was a tight community back then. Everyone knew everyone, and they all liked Lenny. Determined and hard-working, he was soon selling jokes to the best of them. At a gig a couple of months later, Lenny ran into a colleague who was supplementing his income faxing jokes to On the Edge, a hot new show creating quite a ruckus. Michael Parr, the cantankerous and politically incorrect host, was funny and smart, and smart as hell. A rebel, he openly loved hookers and pot, which made him naughty, sexy, and highly watchable. Lenny knew Michael from his stand-up days. After a few well-placed calls, he gained approval to submit material on a paid-per-usage basis. When on his very first day he scored 4 jokes in the monologue, he figured he was onto something. From then on, he began each day with the newspapers, jotting notes in the margins as he drank his morning coffee. A few hours later, he'd usually have between 20 and 40 jokes to submit, and the head writer would call later in the afternoon to tell Lenny what he got on. Not a day went by without Lenny getting that call. After 2 weeks, he was offered a retainer position, which guaranteed him a small weekly salary, whether he scored or not. A prestigious political forum, even Samuel, Lenny's dad, was impressed. I think that meant more to Lenny than anything. His dad never thought much of his stand-up. A philosophy professor, he preferred more intellectual pursuits. On the Edge provided credibility in that world. Likewise, Cookie was a Michael Parr fan. His libertarian politics were almost as right-wing as hers. She was very proud of her son-in-law. This new phase of Lenny's career gave him cred with his peers as well. Most of the comics were struggling to make a living, competing for a few choice writing gigs in the ever-dwindling stand-up spots. Lenny was fortunate enough to be doing both, plus occasional commercials with a new agent, stand-up spots on cable, and corporate gigs. His money soared, as did the regularity of his jobs. It seemed subtle at the time, but looking back, his career shifted on a dime. It was terrific having Lenny home while he did his writing. Usually finished by late afternoon, it left the remainder of the day for fun. On weekends, we still traveled the road, doing the tourist thing by day and Lenny's club dates at night. We spent almost every minute together as a family in those early years, and it was a rare gift for new parents. We appreciated every second of it. About a year later, On the Edge was picked up by a major network and moved to Hollywood. That left Lenny in New York hungry for another writing outlet. Soon after getting the news, he did a stand-up gig with Sheila, a comedian he'd known for years. A bit older, she'd had some looked like she was going to break big success, but it never quite happened for her. Sharing the long drive upstate gave Lenny the opportunity to fill her in on the baby and his recent writing gig for Michael Parr. As he hoped, she offered to get his package to her husband Marty, the head writer at Holler an Hour. Within days, Marty offered Lenny a faxing position. As had been the case on the Edge, Lenny scored immediately. In less than 6 weeks, he was offered a retainer, but this time for our hero, Rob Holleran. The money was better than On the Edge, but still a long way from supporting a family of 3. Lenny continued performing and auditioning in addition to his daily writing. It was one of the happiest times of my life. I was married to my best friend. We had a beautiful baby boy. Lenny was writing for Holler an Hour, and he still got to be with us 24/7. Life just could not get any better. A few months later, Holleran was having his annual Christmas fete. An avid ice skater, he rented out a Manhattan rink for the party. At the height of the holiday season, Marty casually mentioned to Lenny that he'd soon be receiving an invitation. Lenny had yet to meet his new boss and relished the opportunity. I was beside myself with anticipation. We knew a few people that worked at the show, and when a couple of weeks later they'd received their invitations and Lenny had yet to get his, I pushed him to call Marty. Marty assured him it was on its way. Days before the party, it still hadn't arrived. I pestered Lenny to call again. "You'll be on the guest list, just come," Marty said, more than a bit annoyed. It was a rare evening out for us. Without Jack, I was an excited, nervous wreck. The thought of a few hours in a room full of adults was thrilling enough, but anticipating being in the presence of Holleran left me breathless. Going against Lenny's natural inclination to be exactly on time, I was determined to be fashionably late, so our entrance would go unnoticed. Little did I know that we'd run into parking difficulty, which would further detain us. When we finally did arrive, anxious and out of breath, the party was well underway. Dozens of revelers were skating and enjoying hot toddies. As we made our way out to the entrance, I felt like we were approaching airport security without an ID. Behind a long table, 3 interns were manning the guest list. After a good nudge from you-know-who, Lenny tentatively approached the table. Len Blakeman +1? The young man searched the list. Twice. Then he reached for the others, meticulously scouring the pages. There must be some mistake, I jumped in hysterically. Lenny's a writer for the show. He's on retainer and works at home. That's why you don't know him. Our invitation got lost in the mail. Marty said that he'd be on the list. And you know, even I didn't believe me. I'm sorry, but I don't see your name, he said apologetically, looking more than a little embarrassed. Thankfully, at that moment, Larry Pepper spotted us. Larry did warm up for the show. He and Lenny had worked together for years. Hey, Josh, this is Len Blakeman, a fine comedian and a new writer on the show. He's okay, he said to a wink with the intern while grabbing me around the waist. Sure, Larry, go ahead. I'm sorry, folks. Don't worry, we understand. Just doing your job, Lenny said sincerely, inhaling for the first time in 10 minutes. Larry escorted us in, heading straight for the bar, and man, did I need a drink. In a sea of familiar faces, I recognized some from the show because Rob loved to utilize people from the show on camera, and others I knew personally. A few guys in the Holleran band had played at my rock nights. A couple of them I counted as friends. I turned to look towards the rink, and there he was. Wearing a baseball cap, skates, khakis and a t-shirt, a light windbreaker was all that covered Rob Holleran on that freezing winter night. I couldn't take my eyes off him. Even though we'd exchanged hellos before at the cafe, this was different. We were part of the team. His team. Glancing over at the tables, I noticed Danny Robbins. We'd known Danny for years. He started out as a young guy with a lot of moxie who very quickly parlayed it into success. He managed a couple of long-established, highly respected and adored comedians. Chris Nicosia was originally one of his yet-to-break big talents, making better than decent money as a headliner, supplementing the late night with Manhattan gigs to keep him sharp. Chris's world changed a year prior while doing a coveted slot on Holleran Hour. Rob loved him and immediately signed him to a development deal. Chris now had his own primetime show, which was enjoying marginal success in the ratings. It was still young, having only been on a few months. It was not quite must-see TV, but it had potential. I wouldn't call Lenny and Chris friends per se, but they were cohorts who I think liked and respected each other. They were friendly. I'd met Chris a number of times at various gigs. He was shy, at least around me, but at our last meeting, he'd been friendly and thoughtful. I was 8 months pregnant with Jack. Chris had a daughter 3 years old, and he and his wife were expecting another child. And parenthood is like a fraternity. Having a kid, and you're instantly a member. Chris was one of the first to welcome me in. He shared parenting tips and couldn't have been nicer. We were in a tiny club in Greenwich Village late on a Tuesday night. It was basically a no-money gig that the comics did to try out new stuff and stay working on off nights. Like everyone else, Chris was getting the usual $10. Here we were, less than 2 years later, and he was verging on stardom. Lenny and I joined Danny, Chris, and his wife Maria, congratulating them on their rising success, and then we caught each other up on what mattered most, our kids. A short time later, Larry came bounding over. Want to meet the boss? Come on, I'll introduce you. My breathing shortened. Would you excuse me for a moment, I asked Maria, trying to sound calm. My heart and brain were racing. We were only a few feet from where Rob was holding court. Larry comfortably and confidently approached Holleran. Hey, Rob, I'd like to introduce you to your newest writer. Rob, this is Len Blakeman. Rob outstretched his arm, shaking Lenny's hand warmly and firmly. With a big smile, he said, Nice to meet you, Lenny. Welcome. Thanks for the great stuff. And who's this, he asked, turning his attention to me. This is my wife, Andy. I put out my hand, and Rob grabbed it in both of his. Hello, Andy. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having us, Rob. What a great party. At that moment, out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of Marty staring angrily in our direction. Was it my imagination? Paranoid delusion? After a moment or two, Chris, Maria, and Danny joined us. They seemed pretty starstruck and uncomfortable themselves in Holleran's presence. I offered to take a picture of them with Rob. Quickly obliging, Holleran grabbed Chris on one side, Maria on the other, and was I crazy, or did he wink at me? Would you take one with us, boss? I asked. "Sure," he replied, grabbing me around the waist and pulling me close. His other arm circled around Lenny. Chris took the shot. Rob's arm lingered a second around my shoulder. After doing a once around the room, saying hi to old friends, meeting spouses, and future acquaintances, we had something to eat and headed back up with Chris, Maria, and Danny. I hadn't been on skates since I was 12, and I was a better skater then. Lenny, on the other hand, knew his way around the ice. Leading me by the hand, he pried me away from the rail. We caught up to Danny, who was proficient, and Chris, who was holding his own. Holleran came out for a spin. He skillfully and speedily made his way around the rink, smiling and waving all the way. Was he glancing over at me? Joining Maria off the ice, I took photos of Lenny, Danny, and Chris. When Holleran skated up to them, I captured that as well. No matter where I was, it seemed that every time I looked at Rob, he was looking back at me. I was definitely delusional. Just before we were about to call it a night, Chris approached. "I'd sure appreciate copies of the photos you just took." "Absolutely. But I don't have your address," I said, offering him a pen. Chris hesitated. "Danny, why don't you give Andy your card?" Turning back to me, he added, "He'll get them to me." It was an awkward moment, the realization hitting like a bolt of lightning. The baby club had suddenly segregated. A week or so later, I got the pictures. The best by far was the one of Holleran with Chris and Maria. Rob looked so playful in it. There was an unmistakable twinkle in his eye. He seemed to be grinning at the photographer. That was me. I had 2 sets of prints made, one for Danny and one for him to pass on to Chris and Maria, and I sent them off. Not a word came back from any of them. I've since come to appreciate that giving is not about thank yous, but I wasn't as evolved back then. Fuckers.